Dr. Justin Sledge, I am so excited to have you on this podcast today. I am like actually a fan, and to me, having you on my podcast kind of like indicates to me that I've made it as a podcaster. As funny as that sounds, but yeah, I'm really excited to have you. First of all, how are you?
I'm doing great. Yeah, thank you. I just got finished editing a video for the week, and it was a long one. It's like an hour long. So I'm glad to be kind of done for the week.
Yeah, that's awesome. Any teaser for us?
Yeah, it's going to be the second in the series on the history of Yahweh. So it's looking at the emergence of monotheism.
Hmm.
That of course, Yahweh began as a god among gods. So the question is, how did Yahweh become God? Just God. And so, really tracing from the archaeological evidence and from the literary evidence, how did Yahweh become sort of the God of monotheism? And uh, yeah, it should be an interesting. There's a lot going on there, so I think it'll be
Yeah.
interesting for people.
Yeah, I'm excited for that. And actually, like one of the things that I really love about your channel is how you're able to, kind of take your religious beliefs and put them aside and be able to, give this objective historical perspective, like very academically based. And I feel like a lot of the conversation around this type of topic is so embedded with like biases and, it's people's weird beliefs that just come into the picture. And it's like, I really appreciate how you're able to, like, put those beliefs aside and, like, give a more academic perspective, at least from my view. And, I'm just wondering, like, how do you do that? Like, how are you able to compartmentalize and, like, um, you know, be able to give this kind of academic take that you do?
I guess the first thing is that I'm pretty sure that I'm wrong about most things personally. I'm just like I don't have a lot of reason to believe that I'm right about my religious beliefs or about metaphysical things like God or whatever. I think everyone's very likely to be wrong about that. And so my job is to serve a community of people who are interested in sort of where the academic consensus is. Now, I don't know that that's objective. I don't know that that's objectivity. But what it is that at least we know that this is where the conversation is in the academy. We know that that's been vetted through a system of peer review. So we know that they're reading and critiquing each other's work,
Mhm.
and that in order to publish, they have to deal with those critiques, and that there is a shared, agreed upon methodology based on evidence and reasonability. And I think with those things combined, one gets a pretty fair assessment of sort of where things are. But is it when I make a video about Yahweh or whatever, does that mean that that's where the conversation is going to be forever, or is that the objective correct position about what we? No, of course not.
Mhm.
It just means that that's where the conversation is right now, and where the conversation will be in 10 years will probably be somewhere else. So for me, it's less about trying to present some objective take about the end all be all facts of the matter, but more about um, building a bridge between very high level academic conversations and general people who just want to know about this material, and getting the general population um, to a place where they can be part of that conversation and at least read those books and and converse at some level with where this high level academic conversation is. So
Mhm.
yeah, I try to be as unbiased as I can, and I think that the way that I do that is, if you're passionate about education and if you're passionate about the truth,
Mhm.
then the one thing that you have to put on the side, if you're really passionate about education and really passionate about the truth, then the one thing that you have to put over there is you,
Mhm.
because you're not the star of the show. The truth is the star of the show. Education is the star of the show. The people you're trying to reach through your educational work, they're the star of the show.
Alright.
And any educator who wants to put themselves as the star of the show and what I believe and what I am and my story, you're not really doing education. You're just like
Mhm.
me, 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 me. It's like main character syndrome at the level of education. And so I'm not the star of the show. And in fact, on Esoterica, I think very rarely could you get a good glimpse of sort of what I believe.
Right.
Um, 'Cause
Yeah.
that's not my job. It's just not my job.
And I love that. I love the humility. What's coming to mind is as you talk about this, I think about a lot of I guess religious figures and authorities. And I was in yeshiva for many years,
Mhm.
studying. And for those that don't know, yeshiva is a place where Orthodox Jews will go to study Talmud and Bible and other stuff for many hours a day, like from 7 in the morning to 11 at night. and
The entire day, yeah,
yeah,
and
the
then some.
entire day, right? And there's prayers and Talmud study and other studies as well, like philosophy. But I think about them, and they do teach, I would say, from trying to separate themselves, but there is still like like meaning to them, they'll purport that they believe in honesty as a value, like it's important to be honest. But I don't think that them considering the history of, like, Yahweh and how he became God, like, they would never entertain that conversation, Like, they would never be willing to kind of put their beliefs aside to have that conversation, and I think it's interesting because, um, they'll also believe in honesty as a value. I'm not sure if I have a question with this or it's just like a statement, but I'm wondering your thoughts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and again, that we all have our priors, we all have our biases, and they
Mhm.
have their things that they're not willing to shelve. I have those too. Like I'm not willing to shelve the scientific method. I'm willing to say there are problems with the scientific method. There's problems
Right.
with peer review, but I'm not going to give up on those. Those are things that I'm going to those are kind of the hills I'm going to die on, and those are my priors, and those are kind of the background things upon which I build the edifice of what I do.
Yeah.
So look, we're all biased. We all have our biases. We all have our priors. We all have our things that are, even unconscious to us. And for me, it's just the most important thing to be honest about is your biases,
Mhm.
about the things you're not willing to move on. And if they're not willing to move on, the Torah came from Hashem, and it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, it was given to Moses, and then like that's just what they're not willing to give up on.
Right.
Fine. Like as long as they're willing to be honest about the fact that they're basically nothing is going to disabuse them of that.
Mm.
That's totally fine.
Yeah.
That's a bias they have, and everybody's entitled to their biases because we all have them. It's just being conscious of them and honest about them, and that's all I ask.
Yeah.
I would never ask that an educator be unbiased. That's
Mhm.
simply asking them to be something that human beings are not capable of being.
Mhm.
But we should be as conscious of our biases as we can, and we should be as honest about them as we can, and we should check them as much as we can. But that's all we can do.
Yeah, I love that. Tell me about what sparked this interest and passion in esotericism for you. And you mentioned the academia, and I'm curious to hear about that as well. How you eventually went on to, I believe you studied in the University of Amsterdam and esotericism,
Yeah,
and
that's
I'd
right.
just like to hear a bit about that story.
Yeah. So I think, like I think a lot of kids, I was really into like weird, mysterious shows. I really love shows about like Atlantis and Bigfoot and ghosts. And I like to watch scary movies and I used to watch the Bermuda Triangle and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I was really fascinated by that kind of stuff because there was a sense in which there was still something mysterious about the world. And I found those mysterious things like what happened to Amelia Earhart's plane? Like, that's weird. Like, where did she go? And so or lost treasure or something like that. Where did all the stuff from the temple go? Those kind of things really fascinated me. The Ark of the Covenant. Used to love Indiana Jones, still love Indiana Jones. Um, and I think what happens as we get older is that one of two things happen. Either we become a true believer in that stuff and you become kind of a conspiracy theory kind of person, or you become skeptical of that stuff and it maybe is fun TV, but you don't really believe in it anymore and you don't really take it that seriously. I kind of did both. I became skeptical, but I didn't lose my interest. And over time, those interests just got deeper and deeper. And then I discovered there was this thing called like the academic study of stuff, where you could study stuff using uh, uh, academic, uh, academic rigor. That there was a scholarly rigor that could be applied to this that was far more rigorous than whatever was on the History Channel or whatever. And I was studying in the university. I was studying religious studies. I was studying philosophy. And it just became clearer and clearer to me that there was this whole other world of religion and philosophy, this esoteric world of religion and philosophy that just was not getting studied, and I wasn't learning about it in my education. Not because my teachers didn't want to teach it to me, they didn't know it themselves.
Mm.
And yeah, when I finished undergraduate, there was just a thing where I was like, you know what? I've had this thing gnawing at me for like years and years and years. I'm just gonna go and actually like, do the damn thing and like get a degree in this. And so I
Interesting.
applied to the program at the University of Amsterdam and, yeah, I got in and got a little money and I went to Amsterdam and studied this material. And then I came back to the States and did a very boring philosophy, PhD.
Mhm.
And, And yeah, this material I kept studying this material even after I finished my degree. And my brother actually, Jonathan, was like, "Hey, you need to start a YouTube channel, man.
Mm,
Like, this is a place where you can really reach a lot of people." And of course, I didn't listen to him as my younger brother.
yeah.
And I just thought YouTube was like a place for like cat videos and stuff. I didn't take it terribly seriously until I started to realize I was watching educational content on YouTube. I was learning about things on YouTube. I was watching Jackson Crawford talk about, Norse language and myth.
Mm.
And I was like, well, you know, maybe I could do this. Like I'm learning from Dr. Crawford about Thor and Odin and all this. Maybe someone will be interested in me, learning about this esoteric stuff. And I started the channel in 2020, and yeah, it's been quite successful. I've been very blessed.
Yeah, that's incredible, and it's legitimately one of my favorite channels on YouTube. At one point, I was just exclusively devouring your material.
Must make for weird dreams and stuff.
That's interesting, yeah, we could talk about that, but, you have this great, Kabbalah series on,
Mm.
just, like, Intro to Kabbalah, and it's, like, going through the history of Jewish mysticism, and it's fascinating. Um, and, that brings me to wanna ask about, like, the origins of a lot of these, mystical practices, and, I know that there is this fascination with psychedelics now, and, there is, people will take psychedelics and then come to these, like, massive spiritual realizations and, very much feel in line with, Kabbalah, or, like, they'll suddenly become mystics, and it fascinates me, and I'm curious to know if you have any information on, like, the origins of these mystical practices, if psychedelics were used, how they might have been used in these practices. Like, I know in South America, for example, they use ayahuasca to this day as part of their spiritual practice, and that's fascinating, but, yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts.
It would all depend on where in the world and at what time and things like this. I'm sure there's good evidence that that psychedelic drugs were used in shamanic rituals, and alcohol obviously was a um, ceremonially used in all kinds of rituals. Even even God Hashem
Mhm.
uh, drinks what, 6 pack of beer a day, and the a hin of beer and some wine, and even a little bit more on Shabbat. So so even God gets shickered a little bit, and so lots of traditions have had relationships to intoxication,
Mhm,
and managing intoxication and becoming intoxicated or not becoming intoxicated or becoming intoxicated in certain kinds of ways. But when it comes to Kabbalah specifically, we don't have a lot of evidence that there's much in the way of psychedelic drugs at use.
mhm,
Um, we do see some evidence, at least in so Iron Age Israel, where some Yahweh shrines, one Yahweh shrine, the Tel Arad shrine, does have evidence of cannabinoids on the stone which the incense was burned.
mhm,
And if you do some sort of rough measurements, you kind of get a sense of how large that room was, how large the Holy of Holies was in there. It is possible that that was having some psychoactive effect. I think it's totally reasonable to believe that it was. But yeah, when you look at sort of psychedelic use or drug use or alcohol use, the kind of drugs that we would expect to find in Kabbalah, we don't. Right? We don't find a lot of psychedelic mentions of, I don't know, Rebbe Nachman eating mushrooms or anything like that.
yeah,
Um, he probably should have. It probably would have helped him with all the depression he suffered from. Um, Nachman could have used some ketamine therapy, but we do find surprising drugs. For instance, coffee is a great example of a drug. Caffeine. There simply was no the midnight, overnight, staying up late, studying all night, which we're about to do for Shavuos. Um, a lot of that Kabbalistic stuff in the 17th century corresponds very strongly with the first importation of coffee in the first coffee houses in the Ottoman Empire.
mm,
And so those guys were sitting up late drinking coffee, talking about Sphirot or whatever.
mm,
Um, and so, coffee is one of the drugs that really fueled the rise of Kabbalah. I think much more so than cannabis or mushrooms or something like that. But that's not to say that they weren't in use in other in other in other forms of mysticism. For instance, there's pretty good reason to believe that in some of the Greek mysteries that some mushrooms were being used
mhm,
in some form or fashion in alcohol in the Eleusinian mysteries. But
mhm,
the problem with a lot of this stuff is that um, often ancient peoples didn't know exactly what caused the chemical effects that they were experiencing.
Mhm.
Secondly, a lot of these esoteric groups didn't exactly publish what they were doing. They were esoteric. They were keeping secrets. So we don't have a lot of data there. And then also, when you think of something like Merkava mysticism, this is a mysticism of going up, down into the chariots, down into the chariot, into the throne room of God, to the hechalot, the palaces of God. Um, they kind of seem like hallucinatory experiences, but then they seem weirdly consistent in a way that hallucinatory experiences aren't terribly consistent.
Mm.
And also, we do get some mentions from like the High Gaon of some of the techniques they were using to induce these experiences, like hyperventilating and certain kind of body postures and things like this.
Mhm.
So, and we know that there's all kinds of ways of eliciting um, s- uh, strong alterations of consciousness without the use of psychedelic drugs through breathing techniques and physical postures and meditation. So, so yeah, I mean, we have some evidence. It's very meager, I think, but we also have evidence for other kinds of ways of inducing these kinds of mystical states as well.
Mm.
And so it cuts in two ways for me. This is another way of putting it. There's what I call psychedelic reductivism, which is what, psychedelic reductivism is. Someone had a weird mystical experience in history. It must have been drugs.
Mhm.
That's not based on the evidence, right? So I don't think immediately once we have someone having a strange mystical experience, it must be drugs. On the other hand, there's been an anti-psychedelic bias in academia for many generations that says that authentic religious, mystical, and philosophical experiences cannot be downstream of a state induced by intoxication.
Mhm.
And that's obviously wrong too. It's like stupidly wrong. And how to combat the two, right? So this is this pendulum that swings. And what's happening now is it's pendulating very strongly in the direction of anytime something weird happens in history, it must have been DMT. Which is just like, no, like we need to be judicious about how we evaluate the evidence. And if we have evidence for that, we need to name it.
Mhm.
But if we don't have evidence for that, then we should be very slow to say, "Oh, yes, it was drugs."
Yeah, I understand, and I'm curious, you mentioned the Greek mysteries and, like, I don't know, I'm hearing different theories, certain people say, with more confidence than others, like, for instance, there was this, Alexander the Great series that was put out on Netflix, and they
Mhm.
mentioned that Alexander the Great's mother gave him some type of hallucinogenic substance as, like, part of, some type of tradition in order for him to go to Mount Olympus, I don't know if they like, what the evidence. I don't think they quoted any real evidence, but, that's what they purported.
Yeah, that I don't know. I
Right.
I I think that I mean, the truth of the matter is we don't know. We
Mhm.
don't know exactly what was going on in the Kikion or whatever, what they were putting in these in the Hellenistine mysteries is the one that comes to mind. We know the Bakken mysteries where there was drinking, there was alcohol.
Yeah.
Like, and anyone who's been sufficiently intoxicated, which I've spent my time in yeshiva as well, and I know how much intoxication goes on in that environment.
Right.
You can get up to some strange feelings and experience a lot of weird stuff and do a lot of things that you probably shouldn't do. But the truth of the matter is, it's all speculation. We don't know because the Hellenistine mysteries and many mysteries were guarded secrets,
Mhm.
and to this day in the Kabbalistic world, a lot of that stuff passed from teacher to student. It's not written down. And so we don't have good evidence about exactly what those practices look like behind the scenes and what they were and what they weren't. So scholars have to be, I think, just careful to say, this is how far the evidence takes us, and
Mhm.
beyond that is speculation.
I see.
And scholars should feel free to speculate, but they should name it as such.
Mhm.
And so, and that's what separates, I think, good scholarship from crazy people on the internet is that crazy people on the internet, you can't tell where the crazy starts. And scholars just have to let you know this is where the crazy starts.
Fascinating. So I wanna ask you about that, and I'm curious because there's a lot of craziness surrounding the conversation of esotericism and, and I guess it's like, where do you find, like, the clarity for yourself to, like, draw the line of, like, "Okay, this is starting to get crazy. This is actually, this is more academic." How do you draw that line for yourself?
It's evidence. It's what I
Mhm.
have evidence for. Where do I have evidence for something, and where do I not? And And for me, the texts, they can be as crazy as they wanna be. I mean, the Kabbalah's produced all kinds of bizarre text. I mean, the Shiur Koma or something like that is an absolutely bizarre text. But they're bizarre from the outside, but from the inside, they have their own inner logic. They make their own sense.
Mm,
They follow
right.
their own rules. I mean, the Zohar is a very strange text, but it follows its own logic.
Mhm,
And so, for me, the answer is I follow the evidence the best I can, and when I study a text, I accept its logic.
mhm,
It's not for me to impose an outside logic on it and then declare it to be meaningless or crazy.
right.
It's meant to say, no, from the outside, it is strange. Fine. But the task is not to stay on the outside. The task is to get inside the text,
Mhm,
understand it on its own terms, and then present it as sympathetically as you can.
mhm,
Because when we understand a text from the inside, according to its own rules, its own logic, its own metaphysics, its own belief system, it's then, I think, that we can begin to say, oh, this is why the text doesn't make sense. It's because it's
mhm,
contradicting itself,
mm,
something like that.
right, okay.
And so you have to really work hard to let the text speak on its own terms, and that's my task. It's not for me to present a document and just make fun of it for an hour on my channel.
Mhm,
My job
right, right,
is
right,
by the end of an episode is for you to go, "Oh, that does make sense if
mm.
you see it from their point of view."
Yeah, and you do such a great job at that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I hope I do,
you do.
because I think that, you know, history and philosophy should be appreciated on their own terms, even if we disagree with them.
Mhm,
And I think, in fact, we're only entitled to that disagreement once we really understand them. And most of the time, the people aren't actually disagreeing;
mhm,
they're just saying they disagree because they don't understand.
mm, right,
And that's not actually a disagreement. That's just a lack of understanding or a misunderstanding. And so, for me, and I very rarely agree with any of the stuff I present. I'm not on board with most of the stuff I present.
mhm,
But it doesn't matter that I'm on board with it or not on board with it. The question is, can I present it sympathetically enough, that people can go, "Oh, that is beautiful, and it is, interesting, and it is worthwhile, and it is worth studying." Even if, for instance, like, I'm not Catholic, but I present lots of Catholic mystics because I think there is something authentically ingenious about what they're doing. And it doesn't matter that I believe in Jesus or don't believe in Jesus, or what matters is they did,
mhm.
and I wanna present their belief and their enthusiasm and their, I think, profound experiences as sympathetically, and as rigorously as I can.
That's brilliant, and I really wanna ask you, to me, a lot of this stuff, um, within Kabbalah or esotericism and even religion in general, it's a lot of it is kind of unverifiable. And I'm curious to know, like, what is it that people become so fascinated by and so, like, gripped by in these topics and studies and things like Kabbalah, for example? It's like, um, and it's like you said, there is this internal logic to it that people can kind of follow. But I'm curious to know, like, what is this deep fascination and deep yearning that I think a lot of people have for this thing?
I think religion in general, the outward practice of it, most people rightly believe there's more to it than that there's more depth. I mean, if you're dealing with a God, who's infinite, then there must be an infinite depth to it. And therefore, in the same way that a fractal kind of goes on in forever, well, it must be when you're just told to do something in the Torah, like lay to felon. Well, there must be a there. Why that? What does that mean? It has to be more than just putting boxes on your arms and head. There must be something there. And that's a totally reasonable thing to ask about and to wonder about.
Mhm,
And of course, many people don't. They just put the felon on and they do their davening and they're done for the day. They do their prayers and they're done. Well, there's always going to be people who want to scratch a little deeper. And, well, you get to scratching and the rabbit hole goes on forever because, it's an infinite reservoir of meaning.
mhm.
So I think that's part of it.
The search for meaning.
The search for meaning, yeah, I think
Mhm,
that there must be a deeper meaning. There must be a deeper meaning. It can't be just this, and that's a totally reasonable thing to believe and to go after. And I think that for many people, that quest just never ends. They do it their whole life, and I've never met a mystic, even mystics who have profound religious experiences and mystical experiences, who will say, "Oh, I'm done.
mhm,
I'm just like done." They're like, "No, there's still more. There's still deeper to go. The rabbit hole goes on more and more. So I think that's it. Also, the world's just a weird place. I don't know, and I think this again. This is there are many people among us, and I'm in that group to some degree. But I think there's many people among us that just look at the world and go, "This is just a weird place. Why do we exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing?" And there are many people that don't ask these questions. They're perfectly content to live in the world and go through the world without these questions, and I think they're probably better off for them. I believe Kohelet, the more questions, the more suffering. Like, it's better not to even think. But I do think that there are many people for whom the world is strange, and when you see something strange happen, there's a natural desire to get at what's going on there. And so I think that's part of the reason that people are compelled by these sort of esoteric topics, that there must be some more there. It can't just be the appearances of things cannot simply be all that there is. There must be something deeper there. And I will say that that impulse not just does it fire mystics and esotericists, I'll say that same impulse also fires people in the direction of science.
Hmm.
Like, there's I think there's a great comic that I saw once where it shows someone grab something and they electrocuted, and it shows 2 panels below it. It's like a normal person. It's like, "I'm not touching that again." And the scientist, "I wonder if that'll happen again." And it shows them reaching back for it.
Uh,
And that's, that impulse of like, why did it do that? Um, that's a scientific impulse as much as it is a mystical one. And unsurprisingly, we should be unsurprised to find that so many of the great scientists in history were also deeply interested in esotericism. Isaac Newton wrote far more on biblical numerological mysticism than he did on calculus and science. He was far more interested in alchemy
hmm,
than he was in the nature of light. And he thought the nature of light was a relatively simplistic business.
hmm,
What he really wanted to figure out was the exact mystical dimensions of Solomon's new temple,
hmm.
and he wrote a whole book on that no one reads. um, but that was really what he was interested in. Um, so again, the appearances of things are deceptive. And I think most people know that, and then there are some of us that are like, "Yeah, the appearances of things are deceptive, so what's beneath the appearances? What's the ifer? What's really down there?" And that the mystics and the scientists do with all that heavy lifting for us.
So that's incredible, and I'm wondering, have you found any common beliefs, surrounding mysticism from different cultures? Are there any universal takeaways that it seems like people believe in?
That's a great question for, Zevi Slavin, who we both know.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm skeptical. I mean, this is where I'm very different than, for instance, Zevi, who's a colleague and friend of mine, who would say, "Yes, there are core shared concerns among the mystics." But I would say that there's a huge range of disparate positions. For instance, sure, like, we look at Advaita Vedanta and Parmenides, and they both come to some idea that things are fundamentally one,
Mhm.
that there's an underlying unity to all things. But then you look at things like the Buddha and Heraclitus, and they both come to the conclusion that there's no fundamental underlying unity. There's just nothing there.
Mm.
And so, yeah, do mystics from all over the world come to similar positions? Yes. Do they all come to a unified set of propositions? I would say not.
Mm.
I would say not. And even in cases where, for instance, Parmenides comes to mind again. Parmenides gives a deductive argument for why he thinks there's an underlying unity. And then some people just experience that underlying unity and say everything is one.
Mhm.
And that's a very different way of getting at the same question. So this will be an unpopular position, but I'm skeptical. I think that philosophers and mystics and scientists all over the world come to a wide range of disparate conclusions for which there is no grand synthesis
Mhm.
forthcoming.
I love this hot take.
Yeah, I mean, it's informed by reading a lot of mystics and things like that. And this is where I'm very different than perennialists. The perennialists will claim that there is that all the religions are sort of orbiting around a fundamental esoteric core. Um, I'm not a perennialist. I don't think that that's from my reading. Again, I should say from my reading, I don't find that to be convincing.
Mhm.
I tend to be much more on the traditionalist side of that equation,
Interesting.
um, which is again, I think people find sometimes surprising that I tend to be more on the traditionalist side of these things. But I love my perennialist folks. I think that even if I don't agree with them historically or even metaphysically, I do agree that fostering connectivity among the religious and mystical traditions of the world through what we do share, that is a very noble business. That's a very noble exercise, and there's a great deal of shared learning and the building up of mutual respect in the what we share between the traditions. And that project, regardless of what I believe about it, the metaphysics or the literary truth of that, I think that project's deeply admirable. And I enthusiastically support those kinds of projects.
That's great, and I guess I just want a bit more clarity, like, what is it that you find admirable about trying to make these connections?
Where we can focus on where we agree,
Mm,
that gives us a scaffolding by which to have respectful conversations as to where we disagree.
mhm,
And I think we can build up relationships of trust and respect. We can build up relationships of mutual admiration for our shared mutual our shared the places where we agree. And I think that at least gives us a scaffolding about where we can have those conversations, hard conversations about where we disagree.
mhm.
Because if religions are only coming in contact about what they disagree upon, we're gonna have real problems.
Yeah,
Like real problems.
right,
But I think building relationships about where we agree and then being able to foster compassion, understanding, and respect around disagreement is actually probably only possible um, after building up relationships around what we agree upon.
mhm,
So, I think again that project to me that's an admirable project.
mhm.
Um, Again, the other deeper part of me says, yeah, and there's not a lot we actually agree on. Under the hood, it's
Right.
actually so. I would be the grumpy old guy in the corner being like, but, and then other people are like, shut up, like we're trying to build love and kindness and peace, and I hope that they shut me up.
Yeah,
Frankly, I need to, you know, I'm happy to be shut up in those circumstances. The
interesting.
cantankerous old academic, I think he's going to be like, be quiet.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with that.
That's so funny. This is a bit off tangent, but I'm curious to maybe hear if you have thoughts on this. I think politically or just culturally in general, I don't know why this is, but I don't care who you are. I feel like everyone thinks that they're attacked these days. Like white people think they're under attack, Jewish people
Oh
think they're
yeah.
under attack, Palestinians think they're under attack, black people. Like everyone feels like there is like the world is against us in some way. And I'm just wondering, like, I think a lot of that is the sensationalism in media that it just like, fear mongers and pushes that. And that's kind of like the algorithm. But I'm wondering, like, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, why do you think people feel like everyone disagrees with them and hates like what's going on in our culture and society that people have this feeling?
I mean, not being an anthropologist or sociologist, all I could offer is kind of, sort of hot takes, I suppose. But um, yeah, I think that yeah, there's some sense in which if you're being persecuted, somehow you're right. It's the easiest way to be right. It's like requires the least amount of work. It requires no work. It just requires you to feel like you're being persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a kind of sense in which like victimhood grants entitlement.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm very resistant to that kind of stuff. Um, I think that if you're right, it's because you've made good arguments. It's because you make compelling arguments. It's not because you're a victim, and it's not because you're an oppressor.
Hmm.
Oppressors can be right, and victims can be wrong, and victims can be right, and oppressors can be wrong. But because it has nothing to do with that relationship, what's right and wrong, and what's correct and what's not, has everything to do with being able to make compelling arguments about what you're doing and why you're doing it. I also agree with you. There's some, sensationalism and sort of the outrage algorithm that benefits that the person who screams the loudest is somehow getting the most attention. And I don't find that to be a conducive way of conducting intellectual depth or intellectual growth.
Hmm.
And because outrage is not informed by Outrage doesn't it's an emotion.
Mhm.
It's not informed. It doesn't have to be informed by anything. So, yeah, I think that, persecution complexes, just aren't helpful to actually establishing evidence-based, data-driven, historically informed, logically shaped arguments, and it's and all of that undergirded by a lot of compassion and a lot of, respect for the interlocutors that we have, especially when there's real disagreement. But aside from that, it's just like it's infantile shouting.
Yeah.
It's like my kid in the back seat just yelling at me. I'm like, "You can yell as loud as you want, and it doesn't make you right. It just makes you really irritating. I have to deal with you."
Right, right, right. I'm wondering though, do you
Yeah.
have maybe any insight on how to create these more compassionate voices where people are feeling, um, heard and understood? It's like I'm a therapist, and it's like I work with clients that feel very much under attack. Um, and I'm just curious, like what can be done? And it's so funny because in the real world, I think at least for me and my perspective, like I haven't had anyone, yell at me or feel like I'm under attack or anything. But like if I go on social media, then it'll seem like everyone hates the Jews all of a sudden. So it's like, yeah, it's very strange.
Especially if you're in a Jewish spaces,
Right,
on social media. This is part of the reason why I don't have social media,
right,
because I find that, the data seems to indicate very strongly to me that, social media being on social media has a distinct negative impact on one's mental health.
right,
It just
right, right, right.
that seems to be what the data indicates, and,
Yeah.
if someone could ask me like, "Hey, can you walk into a room?" Would you walk into a room that if you knew that you walked into the room, it would negatively impact your mental health? No one's gonna walk into that room because they'd be like, "No, why would I walk into a room that's gonna make me sad and angry? Like, that doesn't make any sense." And yet we download apps and scroll them all day long that we
Right.
know make us sad and angry.
Yeah.
It just, and it's not our fault at some level.
Yeah.
It's the fact that giant corporations have hired teams of psychologists to make us addicted to these apps. That's what I worry about.
Yeah. And
Um,
that fascinates me, and I'm wondering also, like, there's a reason people are so addicted to it. Like, it's serving them in some way. And I'm curious also, like, about AI, and there are also similar dangers there. But I'm curious to know, like, do you feel that with AI, um, the study of esotericism, like, how do you think that AI will impact the study of esotericism? And, like, how can we switch using maybe social media from negative to, like, spread positive things? Maybe, like, talk about the similarities and bridge gaps and such like that.
well, I think you answered the question, right? Is that basically social media, it allows us to be connected in such a way that we pay for that in the currency of sadness and anger,
Right.
and at some level, those dopamine hits are enough to keep us addicted to it. And all the while, Meta and them and laughing all the way to the bank. I have 2 young girls,
Mm.
and looking at the data about basically what Instagram does to young girls' mental health, horrifies me, and the idea that I'll have 2 young girls, one day on that platform that, I know will hurt them at some level, it troubles me deeply. It makes me again see some of the wisdom in the Haredi community around things like kosher phones. We should have mental health phones, frankly,
Oh, yeah.
and again, like the same way that if you were an addict, to gambling, you shouldn't go into a uh, a casino. Ditto, if you did addiction, this a very harmful addiction that we have with social media. Maybe we shouldn't have this stuff on our phones.
Hmm.
Um,
That's a genius business idea.
yeah, mental health phone.
Yeah.
Someone else do it. Um, get the Haredi people to do it. They already figured out the kosher phone thing. It's
Yeah.
just a slight modification.
Mm.
Um, I don't know. When it comes to AI, I'm very, what's the right word? I think our understanding of what consciousness is very much in its infancy, and
Mm.
therefore having conversations about what is constitutive of intelligence in general is probably way off.
Mhm.
And therefore, I'm not super concerned about the threat of general AI and things like that. I do think we will go through I think we will go through a phase where there's going to be a widespread job loss and things like that, because AI is going to be able to automate a lot of those things. In the same way the loom, basically replaced all the the spinners and people like that.
Mhm.
So I do think there will be a tectonic shift there among information workers. Um, how is it going to affect academia? I don't know. I think that in an ideal situation, it would have the same impact the calculator had.
Hmm.
The calculator didn't replace mathematicians; it simply made mathematicians who weren't merely doing calculations able to do the work they were doing much faster and more
Mhm.
efficient. So, in my ideal way of thinking of it, is that it's going to function a bit like a very complicated calculator. That it's not going to replace academics, but it will aid academics who are really doing solid work. It will aid them in doing that work better. But AI is only as effective as its learning environment.
Mhm.
And part of what academics are supposed to do, and this is what general intelligence is supposed to do, I suppose, in AI, is be able to produce new, accurate information.
Mhm.
And I don't know that um, the AI that I've seen so far is not really capable of doing that.
Producing new.
Most of the new solid information, new good information. Um, and so, yeah, I haven't seen that yet. But of course, I mean, I'm pretty sure people said, "Oh yeah, like the computer will never fit in on a desk."
Right. And
And
yeah.
so, yeah, I think, so yeah, and I'm also just not an expert in this stuff. I'm just
Yeah.
not an expert in this. Um, but also, I'm not a technophobe. I still teach,
Mhm.
and I tell my students, like you need to use AI.
Yeah.
You need to use it in your papers. I'm encouraging you, but it's a source. Like, just let me know in the footnotes. In the same way that if you're quoting from a book, you would let me know that you quoted from a book. If you're using AI as an assisted tool for writing a paper, just let me know where it is, because I want to see how it works. Because if we're not on the forefront of the technological growth, then that's a surefire way to make sure you'll be replaced by it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it blows my mind how much like ChatGPT, for example, knows. I was having all out conversations with ChatGPT about Sufism and Veda Vedanta and like all sorts of stuff. And it's interesting because to me it sounded accurate. And then, I know a lot of people complain online that sometimes it could just make stuff up. But it seemed pretty incredible that it just knows information about the most like obscure things, you know?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of encyclopedias and other training data for it to use on the internet. So, so there's a lot of places for it. No, and yeah, it does. It is capable.
Right.
But again, that's the task of, at least for me, is to really get into a source and bring it to light in a way that's never been brought to light before. And I'm sure AI can do that at some point in the future. But at this point, when I've really tested it, you know, I've tested it, for instance, to try to write esoteric episodes, and I would never release those episodes. In fact, I thought to do it one year as a April Fool's joke,
Uh,
just to read an AI generated script without any changes at all,
uh-huh.
and to see how many people it tricked. Um, and I decided not to do that. But at least at this point, I would not trust ChatGPT to, especially with sourcing data. It does terrible at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's pretty good at generating. I would say it generates like C+ papers,
Mhm.
B- papers,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
undergraduate B- papers.
Wow.
Um, but that's about as good as it is up to my mind up to this point.
Okay, interesting. I want to ask you about the practices of mysticism and the occult. And, you know, I think in Western culture, you kind of mentioned that, you kind of mentioned like a lot of the appeal to the occult and esotericism is this search for meaning, right? And like getting at this deeper layer. And I feel like that very often is lacking in Western culture. And I'm wondering, do you find that there may be some practices or things that can be brought into modern day to be used for, finding meaning or mental health, well-being, and personal growth?
I would say they're not absent in Western culture. I would say that they've been largely lost in modernity. That
Mhm.
modernity has had a lot to do with suppressing them. Um, but if you look back to the sort of the mystics of the Middle Ages, so much of what they did was just about slowness, about meditating,
Mhm.
about taking time. Um, it wasn't sort of like there was this trick, there was a hack. We're always looking for this hack we can do. Like, if you just do this and you don't have to, like, I don't know, vacuum your floor. We always looking for some kind of way of hacking the system. But I think so much of what the mystics did was patiently wait and sort of sit in the stillness and sit in the stillness without expectation.
Mhm.
And into those um, vacuums of consciousness, there would enter into these profound states of reflection and excitation and arousal. And if you look, for instance, at most medieval, I'll give you the example of Catholic mystics, but I think this is true of Jewish mystics too. They spend a lot of their day in silence.
Mhm.
They spend a lot of their day um, very slowly contemplating very small things, and we don't do that anymore. We are often desperately afraid of having to be alone with our thoughts,
Mm.
and because those thoughts are filled with anxiety and other kinds of negative things. But the one thing that, or one of the things I notice about many of these mystics is that that's where they were. They spent most of their time in sort of a place of silence and a place of patience and in a place of sort of like, I don't know, active anticipation. And that doesn't have any place in modernity anymore. Um, I mean, look, you can hardly get people to read books. Like, even reading is thought of as like too slow. But I mean, think about the glacial pace of being in a monastery. You're up at 3 a.m., and like things are going very slowly. And I think that slowness is, I think, the thing we could all use. Um, I don't know. What's the joke now, right? That what's what's the greeting that we all exchange? How are you doing? I'm busy. Um, that's a terrible thing to be,
Mm.
because I don't see that busyness actually cashing itself out in productivity,
Mm.
and I certainly don't see it cashing itself out in meaning. It might cash itself out in, I made a bunch of money for some millionaire,
Mm.
and I maybe made some of that money too. But I don't know that any of that cashes out in meaning, and I don't even know that it cashes out in productivity. And if I had some reason to believe that the busyness that we all experience actually made us more productive, then I would be okay with it. But I don't even see that.
Mm.
I'm not even convinced of that. So yeah, I think that the one of the many lessons we can take away is we need to be more slow. We need to be more quiet. Um, and we need to take times out to be slow and be quiet every day,
Mhm.
whether that's a meditation practice, whether that's whether that's just like lying down, whether that's reading a book or being, in some part of nature that's a bit slower than your environment. I think that's something we could all take, and I think it would serve us.
That's such a brilliant point, and definitely I agree with that as a therapist. One of my main focuses is mindfulness, and I,
Mhm.
sit down there and meditate with my clients. Um, and this is so fascinating. I even know people that TV shows are too slow for them. They need the 10-second clip. And that
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, sorry.
The TikTokification of everything. Yeah. Also, I think that we live in a world where awe is very scarce.
Mhm.
That we've built the world around us to make us feel comfortable, and being comfortable can be a tomb. You can die of your comfort. The old
Right.
situationist said, and I think that cultivating awe, experiences of awe, is also another way of um, of derailing the feeling of insignificance and the feeling of meaninglessness. The way that the ways that I cultivate awe is, I have a telescope,
Mhm.
and I love to go out in the night sky. And there's people who say, like, "Don't you look up at the telescope and everything? You seem so small."
Hmm.
I'm like, "Yeah, I'm small, but I'm the one looking." Like,
Yeah.
uh, it's and so the sense of awe when I can see the rings of Saturn
Yeah.
or a deep sky object, or something like that, I really get a sense of awe, and I love showing other people. The first time they get to see Saturn with their eye for the first time,
Wow.
everyone's always like, "Oh my god." And it really is, and every time I see it, it still inspires some awe. and also a microscope.
Hmm.
I have a microscope, and there's something about, we take for granted that, whatever some percent of our body weight, 4% of our body weight are the microorganisms that live on us and in us,
Hmm.
that we are an ecosystem. And that when you can, take a drip of pond water and look at it under the scope and see that it's teeming with life,
Hmm.
it's the opposite of the telescope experience. Now you're the big one and they're the little ones.
Right.
But to see that the world around you is teeming,
Yeah.
um, with things, um, to me, that's a moment of like, oh wow, like the world is not the way that I experience it. It is actually teeming with life,
Yeah.
and appreciating that is a nice way of, for me, a way of cultivating awe.
That's incredible. And like even as you're describing that, I'm feeling a sense of awe. And it's so interesting because, when you describe looking up in the telescope and people commenting like, "Hey, doesn't that make you feel small?" It's incredible how, for some people, looking into the microscope, seeing all the teeming with life, looking into the planets and seeing like, wow, we're so tiny. And then, people who lack a sense of meaning will often feel like, what's the point of it all? Why am I here? And it almost depresses them. And, and then at the same time, somebody could have the exact same experience looking at these things and have the exact opposite reaction of like, hey, I am experiencing this. And yes, it's such a small point in the space-time continuum, like literally minuscule. Like if you take 13 billion years in the past, there'll be 13 billion years in the future, and like just we're these relatively tiny beings, but yet get to have this deep sense of the human experience, like the highs and the lows and everything for however long we
Mhm.
can. Like that is mind blowing, and like the mystery of it all is mind blowing as
Like,
well.
I
Right.
agree. I mean, I think that, you know, even if you want to take this hardcore existentialist kind
Mm,
of everything's meaningless, okay, fine. Like, I agree with you. Like, yeah, like at some point, 100, 10 to the 100 years from now, the last proton might decay, and that will be the end of everything forever. Okay, fine. Like, I it doesn't really concern me.
mhm.
But if it
Right.
all is all meaningless, then the meaningless in itself is meaningless.
Mm.
A-
Right.
And then
Interesting.
at that
Yeah.
point, if the meaningless is itself meaninglessness, then we don't have to attach anything to it.
Mm,
We don't have to feel any way about it. We're not compelled to feel bad about it or good about it. Um, all we're left with the task of, I'm here, and maybe it would have been better if I never existed. I love the rabbis debate this, and you
mm,
know, Hillel and Shammai debate whether and the angels, of course, say it would be better if human beings never existed, and
mm,
ultimately the rabbis even are come to the agreement it'd be better had we not existed. But they say now that we do exist, the task is to be righteous.
mm.
We're here, and you can curse the dark, or you can get to doing something about it. And I'm never one of these people that, um, meaninglessness is an excuse for despair. Um, Despair is a hermeneutic for finding meaninglessness.
Mm.
It goes the other way. And to me, I don't let meaninglessness get in the way of authenticity, or get in the way of awe, or get in the way of a meaningful life. And meaning is not something we're going to find, it's something we're going to build.
Mm.
And I think the idea that you're going to find it out there somewhere, um, is a fool's errand. The question of meaninglessness and the question of meaning is a question of what are we going to build today
Mm.
that's going to be meaningful, and that's going to be um, a conscious decision to do something as opposed to nothing, because it's so easy to do the nothing and to despair over the nothing, and that's a choice, and I'm not going to choose despair.
That's brilliant and that's beautiful, and I love that perspective. And I haven't heard that perspective before of if everything is meaningless, then that meaninglessness is meaningless as well. So like don't attach the despair to it. Um, I love that perspective, and I haven't heard it before, so that's unique. And to me, also, what's funny is like it's I understand from a perspective of like when somebody is down or depressed, it's easy to look at the world and then therefore, and if you believe that it's meaningless, to therefore attach despair to it. But it's like,
Mhm.
when you're in a good place, you could look at those things and have your mind blown and feel the exact opposite reaction. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
yeah.
And I think there may be legitimate reasons for despair. I don't think that
Right.
despair is like There are a lot of people in the world who have very bad living circumstances now, and despair is a perfectly rational thing to be experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, we shouldn't. Again, there's this weird idea that emotions are to be juxtaposed with rationality. No, many emotions are totally rational, and some of them are not.
Right.
And the question is, when so many of our needs are met, and yet we still feel a deep sense of meaninglessness in the world, or a sense of despair, then the question is like, all right, so what are we doing? What are we doing that is inducing these kinds of experience? Because clearly something is not functioning.
Right.
I've been having conversations with people like Zevi and John Vervaeke and other people about what does it mean to cultivate meaning
Mm.
in a world where we're experiencing something of a meaning famine.
Mm.
And I do think that there are ways of turning that ship around. I don't think we're condemned to. I don't think that contemporary society, contemporary life, is condemned to meaninglessness. I think that I think that we can turn that ship around, but it is going to require work, and it's going to require intentionality, and it's going to require doing things that none of us like doing, like building community,
Mm.
because building community is one of the hardest things human beings can do, because we have to deal with the only hell that we know exists, which is other people. Sure.
You know, can you, take me back maybe to the university or, sometime in your journey studying esotericism that were maybe some pivotal points for you?
Great question. One of them most readily comes to mind. Um, I I was an autodidact for a lot of years before I ever got to the university. I read a lot on my own, and autodidacts suffer from being really good at some things and really being really bad at others.
Mm.
Because the autodidact is going to study the things they're interested in, and they're not going to study the things that they're not. So you get really good at philosophy and really bad at, I don't know, math or something. So that's why university liberal arts education is very good, because it smooths you out a little bit.
Mhm.
But one of the places where my autodidacticism in philosophy was that I was very interested in medieval philosophy, Thomas Aquinas and Maimonides and Duns Scotus. And often the way that I framed my thinking was through the lens of medieval philosophy. And I remember there was a moment where I got to university and I had this very medieval way of thinking. Um, I would have made a very good Catholic probably, and
Uh,
or a Maimonidean. Um, and I read Al Ghazali, and Al Ghazali wrote a book called the Tahafut al Falsifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And it's a takedown, a systematic takedown of Aristotelian philosophy. I remember when I read it, it horrified me because it was incontrovertibly correct. Like he had done the task. It's a bit like Kant's moment when he had read Hume, I think. Um, and there was a kind of intellectual despair that I had to experience. This moment of like my entire intellectual system has been destroyed by this guy, this mystic guy. And it was at that moment that I was like, well, if his way out was mysticism and he
mm,
found some truth in it, well, he's clearly pretty smart. Let me go investigate that angle of things. And so
mhm,
that was a moment where I really began to dive into the intersection of mysticism and philosophy,
mhm,
with things like the Corpus Hermeticum and uh, Kabbalistic speculation, and begin really taking that stuff seriously as an intellectual kind of um, yeah, an intellectual kind of mysticism, and
mm.
taking mysticism intellectually very seriously. But yeah, it was a big, it was a decisive moment in my own development.
This was while you were in university?
In undergraduate, yep. I think maybe a sophomore, maybe.
Oh, wow. I'm curious to know if, you found any of these mystical practices, to, like, work in some sense or, like, any magical practices. I know you study magic as well. I'm curious, like, have you
Yeah,
found anything that was like, I guess, worked or is true? Like, I don't know how to phrase the question.
yeah, it's a good. It's yeah. I certainly had mystical experiences, but what I came away with was that the mystical experiences did not solve the intellectual problems.
Hmm.
Um, and the intellectual problems were gonna require intellectual solutions. And, to go back to Al-Ghazali came to that exact same experience. He's like, "Oh, yeah, mysticism solved some existential thing, but it didn't solve the intellectual problems." And, of course, Al-Ghazali went back and wrote huge, long books on Islamic science, trying to combine philosophy and religion in the same way I think Maimonides and many other people did. So, um, yes, I had, the mystical experiences, and I've done psychedelic drugs and all that stuff. But, for me, what I came away with was that while those experiences are very rich, they're not solutions in themselves.
Mhm.
They're not intellectual solutions in themselves. And there must be some meeting of those things. There must be some degree of um, radical, mystical, intuitive knowing, but that has to meet the rubber of the road with rigorous analytic clarity.
Mm.
And no amount of really like logical clarity is a substitution for experience, and no amount of experience is going to give you that analytical clarity.
Mm.
And it is in that dialectic where truth gets found. The truth is deduced neither through pure analysis nor through pure experience, but um, through some um, living unity of the two.
Fascinating. And, I've had, similar psychedelic experiences, um, that had been profoundly, mystical experiences, and to me, they were like, it really blew my worldview, and I'm curious to know how, maybe for you, I know you mentioned you were in yeshiva as well, like, did you find there to be a struggle or maybe a contradiction between, what you had been believing in some sense, and then having these experiences maybe take you in a different direction or confirm your direction? Like, what was that experience for you?
I mean, when I was in yeshiva, I was always I was there sort of as a Baal Shuva and a person coming to Orthodoxy, having not grown up Orthodox. And, it was not a great fit. I mean, I was there in like Brooklyn, with a lot of like Haredi people, some of which believe that, in geocentrism and stuff like that. And I was like, yeah, no, the sun does not turn around the earth. Like, it was like, you know, and they weren't all like that, but some were, and, denial evolution. It reminded me a lot of people back in where I grew up in Mississippi who were Christian fundamentalists. I was like, oh, that's just the same thing on the other team.
Mm.
Um, and so it was never a great fit, but I did want to sit around, yeshiva is great. The Haredi world's great for boys
Mhm.
because you just, especially intellectual boys who want to sit around studying the Gemara all day, and that's what I wanted to do. So I spent time doing it.
Mm.
That was great. Um, but when I first started experimenting with psychedelics, I will say that, yeah, I had very profound experiences. But philosophy, if you get really rigorously trained in philosophy, um, part of what's going to happen there is you're going to skeptical of your own experiences.
Mm.
Your experiences are not indicators of truth. They're indicators that you had an experience. I have all kinds of experiences that aren't true. I look at objects far away and they look little. Well, they're not little,
Mm.
but I experience that constantly. It's because that's an
Yeah.
artifact of how sight works. Um, and so, we've all had the phantom cell phone vibration, right? We've all have felt our phone vibrate in our pocket and check it, and it didn't have an alert. We experience hallucinations all the time, and we hallucinate reality constantly. We have to because our it's how our hardware works. And so, just because we have profound hallucinations, um, we shouldn't mistake those for truths. And the connective tissue of experience to truth is the work of doing philosophy
Mm.
and the work of doing science. And so, for me, there was never a question of did I have mystical experiences that blew my mind, both on psychedelic drugs and otherwise? Sure, but that was never, you know, it was never in the cards that they were going to be um, that I was ever going to be simply be able to deduce from those experiences truths.
Mm.
And I think that's a for me, I can say from my philosophical training, I would say it's a dangerous game
Mhm.
because because when we deduce truths merely from our own experience, well, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and there's a lot of biases. There's a lot of things you can't check.
Mm.
I think it's a dangerous game. I think it's a quite dangerous game,
Wow.
intellectually dangerous game.
Right. Dr. Sledge, I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and doing this with me. Guys, all of Dr. Sledge's information to connect with him will be in the description. Please check out the Esoterica channel. Before we go, Doctor, I just want to ask you if there was one thing that you would want everyone to know, one thing that you could yell from the rooftops for everyone to hear and to know, what would that be? What would you want them to know?
Don't yell from rooftop. Um,
Yeah.
um, oh, I don't know. This is like the moment where I have to give people advice, and this is like where I'm not. I'm a philosopher and not a rabbi. Thank God. Um, oh, I have no idea. I'm bad at giving advice. Uh, when someone asks you a question, take 2 deep breaths before you answer it.
Hmm. Okay. Why do you feel like two
I
deep
think
breaths to think about it?
because I think that if you take 2 deep breaths, the odds of you actually thinking about it, the question, are significantly higher than if you don't.
Hmm.
And I think that if the world, all of the worlds in all of world history, if we took if everyone took 2 deep breaths before they answered a question, any question, what's 2 plus 2? Should I bomb those people? Whatever. I bet a lot less mistakes would have been made because at least those 2 breaths are like 2 distinct moments where, like, breathing in, like, calms your nervous system, gets you a little bit closer to center, clarifies things a little bit more, and it just gives your limbic system, the limbic system and, like, your auto brain, your reptile brain, it gives you just a little bit of clearance above that.
Hmm.
So the decision that you ultimately come to, and it may be the decision you would have made, yeah, but I think a lot more truth is grappleable in those 2 deep breaths than not.
That's
So,
incredible. I love that, thinking before you speak, calming down and, taking the time to at least come up with a calm, respectful response. I think that's brilliant advice. Thank you, Dr. Sledge, again. I can't wait for
yeah.
part two of this to have you again on the show.
Yeah, I'd
Um,
love to. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for a very a wonderful, thoughtful conversation. And yeah, I'd love to come back on.
of course. Yeah. Take care.
You too.
All right, friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to comment your thoughts down below. What was your favorite topic? Additionally, guys, subscribe for more content. And to support this channel, you can also check out the Patreon. This conversation has kind of been like a dream come true for my podcast. Dr. Justin Sledge is somebody that I've admired, and being able to sit down with him was incredible. Next week, I have another guest that I'm so excited about. So you don't want to miss that. His name is Trevor Aronson, and he is an investigative journalist. You may know him as the creator of American ISIS. So be sure to subscribe and tune in for that. That was a incredible conversation as well. So I just love where the direction my podcast is going. To be a part of the journey, be sure to subscribe. You could also check me out on Instagram. And as always, you are capable. Think for yourself, stay curious, and to the rebellion.